Since the beginning of 2020, all Western and non-Western countries have been subjected to unprecedented government measures in the name of public health and under the pretense of a declared pandemic caused by a sickness named COVID-19. These measures have also caused unprecedented damage to the highly interconnected national economies of the world. A seemingly continuous stream of highly invasive measures have been implemented that virtually all run against the long-established general consensus of not only economic science, if in the Austrian or mainstream variant, but also other relevant disciplines such as law and epidemiology and public health. The devastating damage caused by these measures can only be hinted at during this time, but must be documented as a warning of the consequences if such policy practices would continue to be left unchecked by government and private institutions responsible to protect against such extreme instances of government overreach. Over 1 year after the beginning of these measures, now 20 months, this article presents a preliminary overview of the economic consequences of these measures in the world and Austria, which until now has experienced one of the most drastic economic downturns in all countries of the European Union. It outlines how one of the most prosperous countries in the world implemented some of the most severe and self-destructive measures. Most similar countries of its size and wealth had a much more liberal reaction with clearly better results, economic and health-wise. To the measures. In mid-March, the many governments implemented what is now called a hard lockdown, the ominous term taken from prison and psychiatric hospital management, and now even used for public health policy, and is in the meantime also brought into connection with climate change policy. These non-pharmaceutical shelter-in-place orders or forced quarantines were considered ineffective public health policy and morally and legally condemned. Until early 2020, not to speak of on such a large scale as they were implemented. The Times writes, this innovative intervention in pandemic control that was also a medieval intervention was recommended by an English professor at Imperial College London who has an unbroken abysmal track record of grossly exaggerated death numbers due to novel viruses, of which his most recent prediction, unsurprisingly, is no exception. This draconian government measure entails various orders limiting or totally closing vast parts of the economy, social life, and travel routes, essentially forbidding what anybody can call a normal life, and this over a prolonged period of time. More specifically, it includes forced quarantining, which is effectively indistinguishable with forms of house arrest. Individuals in their homes or in hotels, even if healthy, with no symptoms, for weeks at a time or certain times during the day in the form of curfews, vast closures of recreational and tourist industries, but even religious life and health provision on a massive scale, differentiating between essential and non-essential businesses, like we only know from communist commissars in communist countries. Uprooting industries out of the tried and trusted work environment by forcing workers out of their offices and educational institutions to work from home. Lockdowns, if soft or hard, meant all these things or part of them depending on the country. Most Western countries chose a combination of hard and soft lockdowns for extended periods of time. Only a minority of small countries chose to abide more closely by the academic and policy standards from pre-March 2020. Figure 1 shows a list of selected countries and for how many weeks each country implemented a hard or soft lockdown. It shows that most larger countries like the US, UK, Spain, Germany, and France chose longer lockdowns, and most smaller countries like the Scandinavian countries and Switzerland, shorter, and just 2 smaller countries, virtually none. This is a testament on the side to the Austrian analysis that small sovereign states tend toward more liberal policies and large states toward the opposite. Austria was overall in the midfield with 14 lockdown weeks. The one country in the list that you all know of did virtually not implement any lockdowns was Sweden. Sweden's policies focused on the voluntary actions of its citizens by mainly giving recommendations and not mandated actions and closures. The only area that Sweden restricted were mainly cultural and religious, large gatherings over 500 people at a certain point, quite late, and then 50 people. And before Christmas, at the end of the year of 2020, state-run services such as sports centers and museums were closed. Everything else was left to the free agency of its citizens. The other country on the list that officially didn't have lockdowns was South Korea. However, it did have more restrictions than Sweden, in that it mandated distance learning for schools and universities on and off over the longer periods of time, and restrictions on religious gatherings and cultural and food industries. They also implemented mandatory contact tracing programs with strict quarantining of individuals that were considered infected. Aside from these restrictions, South Korea was left open and relied on voluntary decisions of its populace, and was even one of the very few countries that held large sporting events in April. While the lockdowns mark a striking case of uncharted economic policy territory in the West, the more amorphous monetary policies can be considered almost on par with potentially more destructive effects on the longer term. Under the euphemistic whatever it takes policy, the Federal Reserve created M1 money supply of almost 14 trillion US dollars in 2020, as can be seen here. Not mainly by printing of money, but by effectively turning savings accounts into checking accounts, thus massively expanding the disposable money supply. The European Central Bank, with a similar "there are no limits," these are their words, approach to policy has been less abrupt and more gradual over the years, but not less parabolic in its process of mass monetary expansion, and has printed over 1 trillion euros, as can be seen here, with 2 trillion more to come. In the meantime, there's even more. So this is all 2020. Together with the lockdowns, this sort of monetary growth is setting the stage for worrisome inflation, to say the least. And wealth transfers, whose first consequences can already be observed. In Austria, they're expecting 30% increase of energy prices. This is across Europe and the West, as you all know. Further developments will need to be narrated as they unfold in future studies. So what are the general economic consequences of this? As seen in this figure, unsurprisingly, the real GDP growth in 2020 of all countries on the list was negative, even for the countries with more liberal policies, since all countries nowadays are dependent on trade with other countries in one form or another, especially smaller countries. However, most of these countries clearly had less negative growth rates than most countries with extended periods of lockdowns. Norway, South Korea, and Lithuania with a 0.89 negative growth rate on the low end. And Greece, Italy, and the UK, and Spain will be included, with a negative growth rate of 8 to almost 10% on the high end. The measures also had a dramatic impact on unemployment and hunger worldwide. In April of 2020, the International Labour Organization estimated that due to the decline in working hours induced by the global lockdown policies, 1.6 billion workers in the informal economy, which make up nearly half of the global workforce, stand in, quote, immediate danger of having their livelihoods destroyed, end quote. In the same month, the head of the United Nations World Food Programme warned, well, this is in April 2020, that if we don't prepare and act now, quote, to secure access, avoid funding shortfalls and disruptions to trade, we could be facing multiple famines of biblical proportions within a short few months, end quote. Similar to 2019, globally, 135 million are facing, quote, crisis levels of hunger or worse, end quote. And due to the COVID-19 crisis, an additional 130 million, additionally, are brought, quote, on the edge of starvation, end quote, making this crisis, quote, the worst humanitarian crisis since World War II, end quote. Just to compare, 130 million additional people that are in danger of starvation are in absolute numbers more than double the highest estimated deaths of the Soviet famines, including Holodomor from 1932 to 1933 with 8 million, and China's Great Famine from 1958 to 1962 with 45 million combined. The world population has more than doubled since these famines, which doesn't relativize these numbers, but shows us how much more is at stake in today's world. Even if these estimates turn out to have been overestimated, we will see by the end of this year, anything substantially less is still in the realm of absolute catastrophe. What are the estimated costs of the COVID crisis in the USA, our largest economy? According to the projection from the Congressional Budget Office from June of 2020, the pandemic measures will cost the USA $7.9 trillion, without adjusting for projected inflation, 16 trillion of losses over the next 10 years. That's around $25,000 per US citizen, and over 200% of the total GDP of Germany in a year of 2019. And since the second half of the year experienced the same or worse measures, excluding South Dakota and Florida and the US, one can speculate this estimate may have doubled in the meantime, which would mean more than 100% of the total GDP of China in a year. And this is, of course, all in addition to the existing gigantic debt and unfunded liabilities of the United States. With an overall GDP growth rate of minus 6.6%, Austria had the sixth worst economic downturn of the listed countries, and with minus 7.8%, the worst in the EU in the last quarter of 2020, which was plagued by lockdowns. Due to the lockdowns and its effects on tourism, travel, trade, personal services, art, entertainment, industry, and demand on export goods, in the second quarter of 2020, after implementation of the first hard lockdown, the Austrian economy contracted minus 12.8% in comparison to 2019, a singular contraction since World War II. By April 2020, Austria also had a record unemployment rate of 12.8%, funnily, same number. By June 2020, a total of 1.8 million Austrians were forced out of work. Over 500,000 Austrians were officially unemployed, which makes up 11% of the workforce. And 1.3 million Austrians, or 29% of the workforce, were in Kurzarbeit, or short-term work, which does not mean part-time work, but is a name for a government program where the employee doesn't work, but is officially employed, but 80% of the employee's salary is paid by the government, while the remaining 20% is still paid by the employer. So kind of glorified unemployment. This means with a labor force of 4.6 million, a total of 40% of the workforce were forced out of work. Unprecedented since data collection. And there likely is more hidden unemployment, of course. Austria's government debt rose in 2020 by 35 billion. In 2019, it just rose by 5 billion. And first projections estimate that the total private and public sector costs of the pandemic measures in Austria will amount to 175 billion euros by 2024. With a population of over 9 million, this means almost 20,000 euros per person, or 40,000 per person in the current workforce of around 4.5 million. This means the government stole 2 full years of economic productivity of an average Austrian. These costs are added to the current debt, excluding interest, and then Austrians carry a total of 490 billion current and future costs, almost half a trillion, or almost 55,000 euros per person, or 110 euros 1,000 euros per person in the workforce. And with a GDP of 377 billion and state expenditures from 217 billion euros in 2020, the state quota of Austria has reached a record of 57.5%. And if you then include the inflation tax, which will be considerable, you have over 60% quota. If you consider that in the Soviet Union, around a third of all goods were produced in the black market, so in that sense, just 2/3 were socialized and controlled by the government. These two numbers are not very different. So one would assume that these drastic measures causing such catastrophic collateral damage would at least have a clear effect or positive correlation on the purported objective, to hinder or reduce excess mortality. Thus far, there is not only no positive correlation between these drastic measures and these objectives, but clearly a negative correlation. According to a March 2021 Oxford study, the countries that implemented the longest lockdowns experienced excess mortality compared to the previous 4 to 5 years average. And most countries that pursued a more liberal approach, excuse me, here this is a figure of the mortality, pursued a more liberal approach without or with a comparatively limited amount of such mandates, didn't just experience less increase of mortality, but even up to 4.3% decrease in overall mortality, as can be seen in the figure here. Another recently published Swedish study confirms that the lockdowns were ineffective in the reduction of deaths. A US study also confirms this, and that they actually, in fact, increased mortality. There are various other studies which I cite. Another study estimates that the unemployment shock brought about by the lockdowns will lead to an excess mortality of 800,000 over the next 15 years in the US. And to compare, the official US death toll of COVID-19 in 2020 was 375,000. Yeah, so collateral damage is double. A Canadian meta-study examining over 80 studies shows that many assumptions relied upon were false and overestimated the benefits and underestimated the costs of lockdowns, and concludes that, quote, it is possible that lockdowns will go down as one of the greatest peacetime policy failures in Canada's history, end quote. Surely not only Canada. Figure 6 visually places the correlation between weeks in lockdown, real GDP growth, and excess mortality more starkly. Yeah. This comes to show that clear the apodictic truths conveyed by Austrian school economists that self-interested individuals, ceteris paribus, find better solutions to problems, including mitigating a potential new health hazard, than central authorities. The reasons for these drastic measures must be more closely examined in the future, but it shall be briefly mentioned that the careful observer can identify many ends and phenomena currently at play that the economics literature sheds light on. Besides the obviously purported reasons for the sake of public health, the stark departure from established norms of crisis management and their clear disastrous failures must lead one to seek other reasons beside this highly publicized one, be it due to mass hysteria, public knowledge problems, and political incentives to overreact, reinforced by the social media complex, corruption and regulatory capture of international organizations and governments by vested interests such as the pharmaceutical industry and the investors, socialist destructionism, as described by Mises, the return of global socialist utopianism and megalomania a la Klaus Schwab and cronies, or simply the logical course of the perennial socialist errors that have infected the West. To conclude, given these circumstances, one is forced to use normative language, which one is very careful and reluctant to use as an economist, even if it has a venerable tradition amongst Austrian school economists. What the citizens of the world have been subjected to is a barbarism unprecedented in this scope, rooted in superficial, short-sighted, and one-sided science, with hardly any basis in wide academic discourse, and therefore its legitimization in any form is highly irresponsible and indefensible. It must be categorically rejected by figures of authority at all short-term personal cost. A longer-term acquiescence to this barbarism would mean moral capitulation and economic and societal suicide, which the history of the totalitarian experiments of the last 100 years should teach even the minimally interested person of goodwill. If the ratchet effect comes into play, and governments such as Austria continue with their near-total, citing CNN, politics, then they will find no sustainable improvement, economic or otherwise. For Austria to return to prosperity, it must leave this projected path and choose to listen to its great intellectual forefathers. In the face of this, and with a world as populated and interdependent as never before, the warnings of Austrian economists are tragically as timely and direly needed as ever, in the country of its origin and beyond. Ludwig von Mises' adage, is as relevant today as it hasn't been for long. Everyone carries a part of society on his shoulders. No one is relieved of his share of responsibility by others, and no one can find a safe way for himself if society is sweeping towards destruction. Therefore, everyone in his own interests must thrust himself vigorously into the intellectual battle. No one can stand aside with unconcern. The interests of everyone hang on the result. Whether he chooses or not, every man is drawn into the great historical struggle, the decisive battle into which our epoch has plunged us. Thank you.